and the steel that changed history. The winter of 1942 had settled over Stalingrad like a shroud, but Dmitry Volkov barely felt the cold anymore. 3 months in this German prisoner of war camp had taught him to save what warmth he had for the hours when it mattered most. He pressed his face against the frosted barracks window, watching steam rise from the camp kitchen, where Soviet prisoners worked under guard. The smell drifting across the compound was impossible. Real meat, potatoes, something that reminded him painfully of his grandmother's stew back in Tula. Dmitry's calloused fingers traced the wooden window frame, the same hands that had once assembled Mosin-Nagant rifles in the factory where his grandfather had worked alongside Sergei Ivanovich Mosin himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. His own rifle, the one that had saved his life through the defense of Stalingrad until that final mortar blast knocked him unconscious, lay somewhere in German hands now. The rifle his family had helped perfect was now pointed at his countrymen. "You keep staring at that kitchen like it's going to invite you to dinner," the man beside him muttered. Senior Lieutenant Alexei Petrov had been captured the same day as Dmitry, but while Dmitry was just another conscript, Petrov carried himself with the rigid bearing of a career officer who'd rather die than show weakness. "Just thinking about home," Dmitry replied quietly. "Home." Petrov's voice carried a sharp edge. "We don't have the luxury of homesickness. Every day we survive here is another day we fail our duty to the motherland." Through the window, Dmitry watched a German guard approach the kitchen entrance, carrying what looked like bottles of beer. The guard paused, glancing around before slipping one bottle to a Russian prisoner through the service window. It was a small gesture, lasting only seconds, but Dmitry saw something in it that made his stomach clench with an emotion he couldn't name. That evening, during the thin soup that passed for dinner, the same German guard walked through the mess hall. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of long months on the Eastern Front. As he passed Dmitry's table, their eyes met for a moment. The guard nodded, not the acknowledgement of a superior to an inferior, but something closer to the greeting one soldier gives another. "Did you see that?" Petrov hissed when the guard had moved on. "See what?" "The way you looked at him, like he was human." Dmitry's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. In the amber light of the mess hall bulbs, surrounded by the quiet conversations of exhausted men, he realized he was facing the same kind of choice his grandfather must have witnessed in 1889. Back then, in the Tula arms factory, where innovation meant survival, Sergei Mosin had to decide whether to trust foreign collaboration or cling to Russian isolation. Now Dmitry faced his own moment of choosing between the certainties he'd been taught and the uncomfortable truths his eyes were showing him. The next morning brought news that would change everything. A new group of prisoners arrived from the Stalingrad front, and with them came stories that contradicted everything Dmitry thought he knew about this war. But it was the small act of kindness he witnessed in the kitchen, and the way it made him question everything he'd been told about enemies, that would haunt him long after the war ended. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. The compound at Stalag 17A stretched across the Bavarian countryside like a temporary city of wire and wood. Each morning, the alpine air carried the scent of pine, mixed with coal smoke from the German administrative buildings beyond the fence. Dmitry had been here long enough now to map every routine. The 6 a.m. roll call, where Obergefreiter Schmidt counted prisoners with mechanical precision, the work details that sent men to local farms or the nearby munitions factory, and the evening hours when homesickness settled over the barracks like fog. He learned that his grandfather's stories were more than family mythology. In the winter of 1889, when Russia's defeat in the Russo-Turkish War still stung every officer's pride, Sergei Mosin had worked in conditions not unlike these, surrounded by foreign technology, under pressure to innovate or accept failure. The difference was that Mosin had been trying to arm Russia. Dmitry was now a prisoner of the very efficiency his family had helped create. The letters from home painted a picture that grew darker each week. His sister Katya wrote from Tula in careful language that revealed more than it concealed. Bread rations cut again, the factory working triple shifts, neighbors who simply disappeared one morning. Between the lines, Dmitry could read the desperation of a nation bleeding itself dry for victory. Every letter carried the weight of expectation that he would somehow escape, somehow return to continue the fight, somehow prove worthy of the sacrifices being made in his name. "Your family expects you to be a hero," Petrov observed one evening, reading over Dmitry's shoulder without invitation. "Mine expects me to be dead. I'm not sure which is worse." But it was during the work details that Dmitry's certainties began to crack. Assigned to help repair farm equipment at a nearby village, he found himself working alongside Hans, the same young guard who had shared beer with the kitchen workers. Hans spoke broken Russian learned during 2 years on the Eastern Front, and his stories revealed an uncomfortable truth. German soldiers were as tired, as hungry, and as far from home as their Soviet counterparts. "My brother," Hans said one afternoon as they replaced a tractor belt, "he was at Stalingrad too. Infantry regiment." "We don't know." He gestured vaguely eastward toward the front that had swallowed so many on both sides. Dmitry's hands stilled on the machinery. The 7.62mm cartridge that his grandfather had helped perfect had probably killed Hans's brother. Or perhaps Hans's brother had killed Russians with captured Mosin-Nagant rifles, the same weapons Dmitry had assembled in the Tula factory before his conscription. The circular nature of it made him dizzy. That evening, Petrov confronted him directly. "You're getting soft, Volkov. I've watched you. You look at them like they're people instead of fascist invaders." "They are people," Dmitry replied, surprised by his own certainty. "They're the enemy. The moment you forget that, you betray every Russian who died at Stalingrad." "And what if I remember both? What if they're people and enemies at the same time?" Petrov's silence carried the weight of an ideology that allowed no contradictions. But Dmitry had seen something in Hans's eyes when he spoke of his missing brother, the same hollow grief Dmitry carried for his fallen comrades. It was the kind of truth that Sergei Mosin must have recognized when he chose to collaborate with the Belgian designer Mosin-Nagant. Sometimes innovation requires acknowledging what works, regardless of where it comes from. The snow continued to fall over Bavaria, and with each passing day, Dmitry felt the certainties of his youth melting away like ice in spring. In the Tula Arms factory of 1889, his grandfather had faced the choice between Russian pride and technical necessity. Here in 1942, Dmitry faced a different but equally difficult choice, between the comfort of hate and the dangerous complexity of understanding. December brought news that made the barracks feel smaller and the wire fence seem higher. Leningrad still held, but the siege had entered its second winter. Dmitry's cousin Pavel wrote from the city in handwriting that grew shakier with each letter. "We eat sawdust bread and call ourselves lucky. The children don't play anymore, they don't have the strength. But we remember why we fight." The weight of those words pressed down on Dmitry as he worked in the camp repair shop, maintaining equipment with the same careful precision his grandfather had brought to rifle design. But here, fixing German machinery, each competent turn of a wrench felt like betrayal. When he tightened a bolt properly or solved a mechanical problem efficiently, was he helping the enemy? When he worked poorly out of spite, was he only making his own life harder? "You're thinking too much," observed Dr. Weber, the camp's medical officer. He was an older man, probably a university professor before the war, who occasionally visited the workshop to check on prisoner welfare. His Russian was formal but adequate, learned from textbooks rather than trenches. "Thinking is dangerous here," Dmitry replied. "On the contrary, not thinking is what got us all into this situation. Weber's comment lingered as Dmitri returned to his bunk that evening. Around him, other prisoners dealt with their circumstances in different ways. Some, like Petrov, maintained rigid discipline and spoke constantly of duty, honor, and eventual victory. Others had descended into a grey numbness, performing their daily routines like sleepwalkers. A few had begun learning German phrases, trading cigarettes with guards, adapting to captivity with a pragmatism that earned suspicious glances from their comrades. Dmitri found himself caught between these extremes, much like his grandfather must have been caught between Russian tradition and foreign innovation. In 1891, when Mosin's rifle competed against established Mauser and Mannlicher designs, the choice wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. Would Russia trust its own solutions, however flawed, or acknowledge that survival sometimes required borrowing wisdom from elsewhere? The question became personal when Hans approached him during a work detail. "Your grandfather," Hans said carefully, "he made the rifles our soldiers carry, yes?" Dmitri's blood chilled. "How could Hans know that? I saw papers in your file. My father, he was military engineer too. In last war, he studied your Mosin-Nagant, said it was better than our Mauser for winter fighting. Your father studied Russian weapons. Good engineers study all weapons. War makes us enemies, but engineering has no nationality." That night, Dmitri couldn't sleep. He thought about his grandfather's collaboration with Mosin-Nagant, how two men from different countries had worked together to create something that would outlast both their empires. The Mosin-Nagant's simple, robust design had proven superior to more elegant European rifles, precisely because it was built for harsh realities rather than theoretical ideals. Now, over 37 million of those rifles were scattered across the world's battlefields. Soviet snipers used them at Stalingrad. German soldiers used captured ones against their former owners. Partisans carried them through occupied forests. The weapon designed to defend the Russian Empire had become the most democratic rifle in history, serving any cause that could maintain its simple mechanism. "What would grandfather think of me now?" Dmitri whispered to the darkness. The answer came not in words, but in memory. Sergei Mosin, standing in the Tula factory, surrounded by the skeletal frames of prototypes, understanding that nations rise and fall on the precision of mechanisms, but survive on the wisdom to see beyond their own limitations. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. How long can a man carry two conflicting truths without breaking? January 1943 arrived with news that changed everything. The German Sixth Army had surrendered at Stalingrad. In the barracks, Soviet prisoners whispered the details like prayers. Field Marshal Paulus captured over 200,000 German casualties, the tide of war finally turning. But victory felt distant when viewed through barbed wire, and celebration was complicated by the knowledge that their own countrymen had paid an enormous price for this triumph. Dmitri watched the German guards absorb the news with the same hollow-eyed resignation he'd seen in Soviet faces during the retreat from the Don. Hans appeared older, moving through his duties with mechanical precision, but without his previous casual friendliness. The beer sharing at the kitchen had stopped. Even Dr. Weber seemed withdrawn, speaking only when medical duties required it. It was during this tense period that Dmitri made a discovery that would redefine everything he thought he knew about his captivity. Assigned to clean the administrative building, he found himself alone in Dr. Weber's office, while the doctor attended to a prisoner with pneumonia. On the desk lay an open folder filled with medical reports, supply requisitions, and correspondence. Dmitri's eyes caught his own name on one of the documents. The letter was in German, but he recognized enough words to understand its meaning. Dr. Weber had been writing to camp authorities, requesting additional medical supplies, better heating in the barracks, and improved food rations for prisoners showing signs of malnutrition. The document was a careful, bureaucratic argument for treating Soviet prisoners as human beings rather than industrial resources. "You read German better than I expected," came Dr. Weber's voice from the doorway. Dmitri spun around, expecting punishment, but the doctor's expression was more resigned than angry. "I read enough to understand you've been helping us. I've been doing my job, nothing more. Your job doesn't require you to request extra blankets for Russian prisoners, or to argue for larger food portions, or to report equipment failures that make our work details more dangerous than necessary." "Doctor." Weber moved to his desk and quietly closed the folder. "Your grandfather's rifle, you know, it saved German lives too. During the last war, when we captured them from Russians, our soldiers found they worked better in winter than our own weapons. Good engineering serves whoever needs it. That doesn't make us friends." "No, but it makes us human beings dealing with an inhuman situation." The conversation was interrupted by Hans entering with urgent news. 3 prisoners had collapsed during morning work detail. As Dr. Weber gathered his medical supplies, Dmitri found himself automatically helping, passing instruments and supplies with the efficiency of someone who understood the urgency of the situation. Working together over the unconscious prisoners, nationality became irrelevant. Dmitri held airways open while Weber listened for heartbeats. Hans fetched hot water and blankets. The Russian prisoner who had learned some German translated symptoms and medical history. For 20 minutes the war receded, and they were simply people trying to keep other people alive. It was only later, back in the barracks, that the moral complexity of the situation hit Dmitri fully. He had helped save Soviet lives, but he had done it by cooperating with German efficiency. His grandfather had faced similar paradoxes in 1889, creating weapons that would eventually arm revolution against the very empire that commissioned them. "I saw you working with them," Petrov said quietly. "In the infirmary. Men were dying. German men would have let us die. Maybe, but these particular German men didn't." Petrov's silence carried the weight of an ideology beginning to crack. Around them, other prisoners pretended to sleep, but Dmitri sensed they were listening. The questions hanging in the cold air were the same ones that had haunted his grandfather. How do you serve your people when serving them requires acknowledging the humanity of your enemies? How do you remain loyal to your beliefs when reality contradicts everything you've been taught? Outside the barracks windows, snow continued to fall over Bavaria, covering German and Russian soil with the same white silence that had once fallen over the Tula arms factory, where Sergei Mosin bent over his workbench, understanding that nations rise and fall on more than the precision of mechanisms. They depend on the willingness of individuals to see beyond their own certainties. What would you remember more, hunger or kindness? The central revelation came in March, during the spring thaw that turned the compound into a maze of mud and possibility. Dr. Weber had requested Dmitri's permanent assignment to the infirmary, citing his mechanical aptitude and reliable temperament. It was there, organizing medical supplies in a storage room, that Dmitri found the doctor's personal journal wedged behind a cabinet. The journal was written in careful German script, but scattered throughout were Russian words and phrases. Not the formal Russian of textbooks, but the intimate vocabulary of someone who had lived among Russian people. As Dmitri read, a story emerged that reframed everything he thought he understood about his captivity. Weber had spent 2 years in Russia before the war, from 1938 to 1940, working as a medical consultant at a Moscow hospital. His journal described evenings spent in Russian homes, sharing meals and conversation with colleagues who had become friends. He wrote about attending performances at the Bolshoi, about learning to appreciate the complex flavors of borscht, about long conversations with Dr. Mikhail Petrov, a Soviet physician who had become his closest friend during those years. The entries grew darker as 1941 approached. Weber described his anguish at watching political tensions escalate, knowing that his friendships with Russian colleagues would soon be redefined as consorting with enemies. His final entry from Moscow was dated June 1941. Tomorrow I return to Germany. Tonight Mikhail and I shared a final meal together. We both know we may meet again as enemies. How do we carry friendship across a battlefield? How do we remember shared humanity when forced to see only nationality? Dr. Mikhail Petrov. Dmitri's heart stopped. The name matched exactly. Lieutenant Petrov in the barracks had mentioned his father was a doctor in Moscow. "You found my journal," came Weber's voice from behind him. Dmitri turned, expecting anger or punishment, but Weber's expression held only weary sadness. "Dr. Mikhail Petrov. You knew Lieutenant Petrov's father." "Mikhail was my closest friend in Moscow. We worked together, learned from each other. When I treat his son now, I see Mikhail's eyes looking back at me. Does Lieutenant Petrov know? How could I tell him? How do I explain that his enemy once saved Russian lives in a Moscow hospital, that his father and I planned to write medical textbooks together before politics made us adversaries?" Weber moved to the window, gazing out at the compound where Soviet prisoners and German guards maintained the careful choreography of captivity. "Your grandfather's rifle. It's become a symbol of something he never intended. Sergei Mosin designed it to protect Russia, but now it arms revolutions everywhere. Vietnamese rebels use it against French colonials. Afghan fighters will probably use it against whoever tries to control them next. Good engineering transcends the intentions of its creator. You think my grandfather would approve? I think he would understand that innovation always escapes its original purpose. The rifle he created to defend the Tsarist Empire became the weapon that destroyed it. The friendship I built with Mikhail Petrov in Moscow now forces me to treat his son with the same care I would give my own family, not because of politics, but because some bonds survive even war." That evening, Dmitri faced an impossible choice. Lieutenant Petrov approached him in the barracks, his usual rigid composure cracked by rumors that his father had been killed in a German bombing of Moscow. Weber had shared medical supplies and information that could comfort Petrov, but doing so would require revealing the connection between them, a revelation that could shatter Petrov's ideological certainties. "The doctor, Weber," Dmitri began carefully. "He knew your father." "Knew him how?" "They worked together. Before the war, in Moscow." Petrov's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally a terrible understanding. "The German doctor was friends with my father." "Yes. And he's been treating me knowing this?" "Yes." The silence that followed contained multitudes. 37 million Mosin-Nagant rifles had been produced, becoming history's most prolific military weapon, serving causes across every continent. But here, in this small moment, the question was simpler. Could a man accept kindness from someone whose nation had killed his father, especially when that kindness was rooted in love for the same man? Petrov's answer would echo through both their lives long after the war ended. "If you came home with this story, who would you dare to tell?" Lieutenant Petrov's response surprised everyone, perhaps even himself. Instead of rage or rejection, he simply asked to speak with Dr. Weber. The conversation took place in the infirmary the next morning, with Dmitri serving as translator when emotion made language difficult. Weber spoke about Mikhail Petrov, not as enemy or ally, but as a friend whose loss diminished the world. Petrov listened with the rigid control of a soldier processing intelligence that contradicted every briefing he'd received. "My father mentioned a German colleague," Petrov said finally. "He said this man understood medicine the way good engineers understand steel, that healing has no nationality." "Mikhail saved more lives than both of us will ever count," Weber replied. "His techniques for treating frostbite, they're keeping your comrades alive in this camp." The spring of 1943 brought changes beyond weather. News arrived that the camp would be relocated, with most prisoners transferred to work details in German factories. The war's momentum was shifting, and the Reich needed labor more than prisoners. For Dmitri, this meant separation from the strange community that had formed around Dr. Weber's quiet acts of humanity. On his last evening in the Bavarian camp, Dmitri received an unexpected summons. Dr. Weber waited in his office, along with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For your journey," Weber said, "and for after the war." Inside was a piece of bread, real bread, not the sawdust mixture that had become routine, along with a small metal object that made Dmitri's heart stop. It was a bolt mechanism from a Mosin-Nagant rifle, carefully preserved and polished. "I found it among personal effects from Stalingrad," Weber explained. "It may not be from your rifle specifically, but it's from the same factory where your grandfather worked." "Where you worked." "Why are you giving me this?" "Because someday, when this war ends, people will try to forget the complexity of what happened here. They'll want simple stories about heroes and villains. This bolt mechanism represents something more difficult to explain, the idea that good engineering, like good medicine, serves human need regardless of the uniform worn by the person who needs it." The final twist came as Dmitri prepared to leave for his new assignment. Hans approached him during the last roll call, speaking in careful Russian. "Your grandfather's design," Hans said. "It saved my life at Stalingrad. Captured rifle, Soviet ammunition. When my Mauser jammed in the cold, the Mosin-Nagant kept firing." "So you killed Russians with a Russian rifle?" "Yes, and Russian soldiers killed Germans with German weapons. War makes everything backward." "What will you remember when this is over?" Hans considered the question seriously. "I'll remember that hunger makes all soldiers look the same, and that sharing food makes enemies look like people." The transport train that carried Dmitri away from Bavaria in April 1943 also carried Lieutenant Petrov, both men forever changed by their exposure to complexity. They spent the journey discussing what they would tell their families when the war ended, if they survived to tell anyone anything. "Will you mention Dr. Weber?" Dmitri asked. "How can I explain that a German doctor honored my father's memory better than our own propaganda honors living heroes?" Petrov's smile held no bitterness, only tired recognition of truth's inconvenient nature. Years later, after the war had ended, and both men had returned to the Soviet Union, they would meet again in Moscow. Petrov had become a factory supervisor, implementing safety protocols he'd learned from watching German efficiency. Dmitri had returned to Tula, where he worked in the same arms factory his grandfather had helped modernize, but now producing tools for reconstruction rather than weapons for war. They would never speak publicly about Dr. Weber's kindness or Hans's moment of shared humanity. In Stalin's Soviet Union, such stories were not merely politically inconvenient, they were dangerous. But both men carried those memories like the bolt mechanism Dmitri had preserved, small, precisely engineered reminders that human connection could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. In the end, the legacy of Sergei Mosin's rifle lay not in its mechanical specifications, but in its embodiment of a distinctly Russian approach to innovation. Pragmatic over elegant, durable over sophisticated, democratic over elite. The rifle had armed revolutions that toppled governments and redrew maps across the globe, but its truest impact was smaller and more personal, in moments when enemies recognized each other's humanity and chose mercy over doctrine. Dmitri would sometimes hold that polished bolt mechanism and remember Dr. Weber's words about good engineering serving human need regardless of nationality. He would taste phantom flavors of real bread and remember that kindness, unlike hate, leaves marks on the soul that time cannot erase. Sometimes in his final years, he would wonder if his grandfather had understood this paradox when he created a weapon that would outlive the empire it was meant to defend. The mind behind the weapon, Dmitri realized, had mattered more than the weapon itself. And sometimes the greatest innovations come from those whom history barely remembers, not just engineers and inventors, but doctors who honor their former friends by treating enemies with dignity, guards who share beer across the barriers of war, and prisoners who choose to remember shared humanity rather than embrace convenient hatred. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.